Hello, and welcome to another episode of Casual Learning. I'm your host, John Bannan. What's the deal with proof? I hear a lot of people uh, claim that they've just debunked something or that something has been disproven um, simply based on the fact that they've raised some sort of objection or counter argument to an assertion. And uh, they don't understand that that is not actually true. They haven't actually disproven anything. To disprove something means that you have to persuade that something, some proposition, is not worthy of belief. It's not true. And just because you can raise an objection or um, make a counter argument to something does not mean you've disproven it. It's a rare proposition that doesn't have any sort of opposition or counter argument or some sort of objection that you can make about it. So it's not disproving something is not simply about making objections to it. It's making counter arguments and objections that are persuasive to the listener or the reader to believe that they are correct. So this brings up the issue of proof. What is proof? And people have wrong ideas about what proof really means. Proof is essentially a level of persuasion. So some people have this idea that there is an objective proof that somehow is correct in and of itself, and it doesn't require anyone to agree that it's true. And that's simply not the case. There are no such things as objective proofs. Everything is subjective in terms of proof because proof is a level of persuasion. So a proof is what makes a person believe something is true or worthy of belief. So it's always subjective in that sense. Um, when people refer to things like objective proofs, what they're really talking about are arguments that the vast majority of people would agree makes some proposition worthy of belief. So when they say objective, it's really just a whole lot of people would agree with this, and it's so many people would agree with this that we'll just call it objective because the odds that you won't agree with this are slim to none. But that's not really objective. It's a high level of persuasive value to a very high level number of persons. Um, so ultimately, proof really comes down to did you persuade the listener or the reader that such and such is worthy of belief or is true? That's what proof is. Uh, I run across a lot of, uh, especially atheists, who claim that this or that proof has been debunked. And invariably, these atheists are not using the word debunked properly. Debunked does not mean that a proposition doesn't have counter arguments or objections being made to it. As I said, it's the rare proposition that doesn't have any objections or counter arguments that could possibly be made. That's pretty rare. Usually, you can always find somebody who will argue the opposite. Um, so, debunking actually means to prove a claim is false or um, not worthy of belief. So, debunking means you've proven something is false. Uh, that means you've persuaded the listener or the reader that such and such is not worthy of belief. Uh, when it comes to atheists arguing arguments for God are debunked, it's almost never the case that they've debunked an actual argument and they've proven to you, the listener or reader, that this argument is not worthy of belief. They usually misinterpret the word debunked and they essentially mean that, well, we've raised an objection or a counter argument and therefore it's not worthy of belief. Well, that's just not the case. Um, Proof has to do with the level of persuasion, not the number of counter arguments or objections you can raise, regardless of how relevant those objections or counter arguments might be. Um, so, when you're talking about proof, you're really talking about the level of persuasion, and that involves the standard of proof or the level of certainty that something is true. So, for instance, in the law, there are certain standards of proof, which are really levels of certainty that are required in order to believe something is true or not. And that can be a helpful guide in discussing proof. In terms of everyday life, there are no rules regarding levels of certainty that you must have to believe something is true. People are all across the range on this issue. Some people believe things and they have no idea why they believe them. Maybe because somebody told them that. Some people require very high levels of certainty with regard to certain facts that they believe to be true. But in general, in life, there is no rule book of life regarding what it is you're allowed to believe and what it is you're not allowed to believe and how much certainty you're required to have in order to believe something is true. But in something like the law, where there are rule books and there's a reason for creating these sorts of rules, they do have formal levels of certainty, which can be useful in understanding the concept of proof. So, for instance, in the law, um, the general standard or level of certainty is what is called the preponderance of the evidence. Now, the standard of preponderance of the evidence simply means that something is more likely than not. That means it's at least 50% uh, or greater a likelihood that it's true. And if two things are equally weighted, a preponderance means it's slightly more weighted on the proposition than on the opposite proposition. So it's actually 50% plus degree of certainty. But the preponderance of the evidence is a very general, common, everyday standard that most people use to decide whether something is true or not. And they simply ask themselves, is this more likely or not than not? Is is this likely to be true? Uh, very fair standard for deciding anything, whether something's true or not. In the law, that standard is used primarily in civil lawsuits, but it's a very common sense standard for any sort of proposition. It's more likely than not. Uh, Issues like, is there a God? That's a fair um, question that really would require a standard of proof similar to preponderance of the evidence. Is it more likely than not that there is a God? If it's more likely than not, then believing in God is the right thing to do. That's how we decide most everyday issues. And there's nothing about God in particular that requires a higher level of certainty or a higher standard of proof. Not at all. You'll hear atheists try to argue that the standard of proof should be higher on the issue of God, but there is no good reason for that. They're just saying that to make their argument sound stronger than it really is. So, another standard in the law would be clear and convincing evidence. Clear and convincing evidence is stronger level of certainty, a higher level of certainty than a preponderance of the evidence. But it's not 100% certainty. 100% certainty or absolute certainty, I'm not sure anything is capable of that level of certainty. Um, People say they're 100% certain, but the truth is, it's impossible to exclude every possible way out of something, every exception. Um, so 100% certainty is a very dubious assertion. Even in science, where they use a number of standard deviations to indicate the level of reliability of a particular study, they don't even go to 100% certainty. Well, for instance, they use sigma, so they might have 5 sigma, to indicate that a scientific study is worthy of belief. And what that really means is it's like 99.99% certain, but it's not 100% certain. A pure 100% certainty would be an infinite sigma, an infinite number of standard deviations away from the center distribution, which of course is meaningless. I mean, it's unending distance away. So 100% certainty is technically, I'm not even sure it's possible, but you can have a 99.99% certainty, like a 5 sigma, and that's pretty close. But 100% certainty, I think it's a myth. So another standard would be beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt is a higher level of certainty than clear and convincing evidence. And beyond a reasonable doubt, that standard of proof is used in criminal cases to convict somebody of a crime. And the reason you use a higher level of certainty when you convict somebody in a criminal case, as opposed to a civil case, is because you're taking away this person's liberty and you're putting them in jail. And that's a much more significant consequence than in a civil case where you're taking away somebody's money. So that's why we have such a high standard in criminal cases, that level of certainty. But when it comes to the issue of God, there's no reason that the issue of does God exist has to be decided by such a high level of certainty that you would use to deprive somebody of their liberty by putting them in prison, such as beyond a reasonable doubt. So again, the issue of is there a God or not, really a fair standard for that is preponderance of the evidence, or is it more likely than not? Now, once you understand what proof is and what standards of proof are and levels of certainty, the next question is, well, how do you show that? And, you know, people can believe things even for no reason whatsoever. But generally speaking, uh, people require evidence in order to believe something is true. Now, evidence uh, is anything that has a tendency to make the existence of any fact that is of consequence to the determination more or less probable. So evidence is anything that's relevant to a particular issue, and it makes it more or less probable to any degree. If it makes it slightly more probable, it's evidence. If it makes it slightly less probable, it's evidence. It just has a tendency to make something more or less probable. That's all evidence is. Now, there are many different types of evidence, and uh, in common everyday life, there's no rule book that says you're limited to certain types of evidence when you decide something. You're, as a free human being, you're allowed to decide based on any sort of evidence whatsoever, or even no evidence. There's no rule book on this for human beings, and there's no rule book on this in terms of the question of does God exist? There's no rules. You're not bound by anything on that question, not at all. Um, However, for example, in the law, in legal proceedings, they do have strict rules regarding what sorts of evidence the fact finder is permitted to consider. And these rules are designed to basically make sure that only relevant and fair evidence is considered when deciding, somebody's fate, whether they're going to jail or not, or whether they're going to hand over a lot of money to a plaintiff. Um, However, again, on the issue of God, those rules don't apply. You can use whatever evidence you want, but it's helpful to go through the list of evidence so that you have an idea of what kinds of evidence there are. You'll run into uh, atheists, for instance, who will claim that you need only or solely scientific evidence to prove the existence of God. That is false. Absolutely false. Not true. There's no rule book that says that. You are free to use any evidence you want whatsoever. You are not limited to scientific evidence. And this is just a setup argument that atheists use to make their position look much stronger than it really is. So, but scientific evidence is one form of evidence. Now, scientific evidence is evidence that's derived from the scientific method, a study done by a scientist using experimentation, a particular method. Um, Oftentimes, the results of scientific studies are published in journals and read by other scientists. Science involves examining some behavior of physical reality and make drawing conclusions based on that. So it's scientific evidence is very strong evidence. It's one of the strongest types of evidence there are, but it's not indisputable evidence. And often scientists disagree among themselves about the truth of any given proposition. But there's a lot more forms of evidence than just scientific evidence. For instance, there's circumstantial evidence. And circumstantial evidence is it's not direct evidence that directly proves a fact, but it's circumstances which imply the existence of a fact. So, for instance, uh, if uh, you wake up in the morning and you look out the window and you see there's snow on the ground, and before you went to bed, you looked out the window and there wasn't any snow on the ground, you can infer that it snowed while you were sleeping. That's circumstantial evidence. It's not direct evidence that it was snowing because you didn't see the snow come down. You were asleep. But it's circumstantial evidence that that's exactly what happened while you were sleeping. The snow was coming down um, because you saw the results of it the next morning. Circumstantial evidence. Another type of evidence is witness testimony. Witness testimony. Someone saw it. Someone can testify that they saw it with their own eyes, or they experienced it, or observed it somehow, and they're going to report to you what they saw, or what they felt, or how they their observations, what their observations were. There's also expert testimony. Expert testimony is testimony given by somebody who has studied some particular subject and knows it really, really well, and they're an expert in it, and they can give you their opinion as to whether a fact is true or not based on all their learning and experience and knowledge and skill. It's not witness testimony where you have somebody who actually observed something occurring. It's expert testimony is a greatly informed opinion about whether something is true or not. You can have historical documents. You can look at records, old records, things that are in writing or some other format that were produced close in time to when the thing occurred, and it tells you what happened. His recorded documents are clearly another form of evidence. Hearsay can be evidence. Hearsay is somebody's telling you what somebody else told them, or telling you what somebody else told them that somebody else told them. Uh, you're allowed to use hearsay in forming your beliefs about whether something is true or not. Now, in the law and legal proceedings, there are strict rules regarding the admissibility of hearsay in court. Um, but it can be admitted in certain circumstances. And again, you're not bound by court rules of evidence. You're allowed to use whatever you want. So hearsay is also another form of evidence that people use to decide whether something is true or not. There's inferences based on logic and reasoning. You can infer a fact is true based on logic and reasoning. Um, if a certain set of premises leading to a conclusion makes sense to you, then you can use that as evidence to infer that something is true, that the fact is true. Oftentimes, philosophical arguments, for instance, use inferences, allowing you to infer truth based on logic and reasoning. There's presumptions. And a presumption is basically a default position about the truth of something. Um, so instead of starting off with, well, I don't know whether this thing is true or not, we'll have to decide. Presumption says um, either it is true or it isn't true, unless you decide otherwise. A presumption, and the law is full of presumptions that can be rebutted. But in everyday life, we make presumptions all the time. That for instance, if um, a priest said something happened, there's a presumption that the priest is not a liar and they're telling the truth. Now, it doesn't matter what the priest says; it's the fact that the priest said it that makes you presume that it's true. There's an example of a presumption. Or somebody who's is a notorious liar, and they say something. Your default is going to be this person's lying. Like the boy who cried wolf. That's a presumption, but that's also evidence that you can use in deciding whether something is true or not. There's also mathematical evidence. A certain formula tells you that something is true. Some sort of calculation. Maybe a statistical analysis says that something is likely, or the degree of likelihood of, X, Y, and Z. There's mathematical evidence as well. Uh, there's demonstrative evidence. Demonstrative evidence is where somebody demonstrates to you that this has to be true, maybe through some sort of modeling or some sort of simulation, some sort of experiment. They demonstrated this truth to you. Then you have analogical evidence. Someone uses an analogy to prove something is true. Well, I might not be able to prove this thing, but I can show you how it's similar to this other thing, this analogy. And because this analogy proves this, then you can use that as evidence that this must also be true through analogy. Um, there's anecdotal evidence. And anecdotal evidence is really just, your stories or experiences in dealing with similar circumstances. And this is what happened. And that's why you think it's true, because this has happened to you in your life experiences. Anecdotal evidence, examples that have happened to you in the past. That's also evidence. There's character evidence. Character evidence is, well, what kind of person is this? How have they behaved in the past? What is their pattern of behavior and repetition? Um, oftentimes it comes down to, well, is this a trustworthy, honest, good person, or is this a lying, rotten, you know, lousy person? What kind of character does this person have? That may tell me, that's evidence as to whether I should believe them or not. There's physical evidence. Physical evidence is, there's some physical reality which is involved that you can see or you can observe, or there's some sort of demonstration that this is true. Uh, you know, photographs or samples or physical items of some sort or marks that indicate whether something's true or not. It's not exactly scientific evidence because scientific evidence has a particular method to it. But it's physical evidence nonetheless. And, many people believe seeing is believing. So if you can show them some physical evidence, that can be highly persuasive to many people. But that's not the only form of evidence. There's also spiritual evidence. Spiritual evidence is evidence that the spirits are telling you. It can be feelings, of supernatural forces of any sort. A lot of people may not believe that sort of evidence, but a lot of people do. But it's still evidence. It's still something you can use to decide whether something is true or not. Now, in terms of persuading somebody using evidence, there are there are all sorts of people who require different levels of certainty or different types of evidence. Certain types of evidence are more persuasive with certain types of people, and other sorts of evidence are more persuasive with other sorts of people. And this is important to remember and understand. There's no objective standard or level of certainty or type of evidence that must be used for everyone universally. People are very different, and they all have their own standards and what they consider evidence. Some don't even use evidence. So, the arguments, persuasive arguments, should be tailored to the particular person that you're talking to, or who is listening, or your audience. So you'd have to know what's persuasive to them and what isn't. On the issue of does God exist, for instance, uh, there is no objective proof on that. All proofs are subjective. All proofs depend on whether you personally, as the reader or listener, believe something is true or not. Uh, no one can tell you um, whether you should believe in God or not. That's your own subjective decision. It's based on what level of certainty you require, what kinds of evidence you require, and you're not wrong about that. That is your um, personal decision with regard to what you want to use to decide something like that question. However, you can be informed by what others have to say about the question in deciding what you believe about that question. And certainly, you can always become more educated about things. Um, but some people are pickier, much pickier than other people, and they may require much higher levels of certainty or certain sorts of evidence uh, than are necessary for a belief in God. And don't get fooled into thinking that there is a set level of certainty or a set type of evidence that is required to believe in God. There isn't. So when somebody says, well, to believe in God, you need to have a very high level of certainty approaching 100%. That's not true. Not true at all. Uh, Preponderance of the evidence is clearly good enough on this question. And indeed, some people, they don't even require that level of certainty. Or if some atheist tells you, well, you have to have scientific evidence in order to believe in God. Again, that's not true. These are lies. There's all sorts of types of evidence that you can use besides scientific evidence. Um, so, and yeah, scientific evidence is, best kind of evidence you can have, but it's not necessarily the only type of evidence. And on a question like, well, does God exist? Science doesn't even is very anemic on that entire question, and the reason is because science, scientists, scientific instruments, there's no way for them to leave the universe to study the question because the law of conservation of energy and mass prohibits science from leaving the universe to uh, study the question of the existence of the universe, the cause of the universe. So, anyone demanding scientific evidence to believe in God is wrong. They're really just wrong. Um, uh, there is some science that can help on that question, like the Big Bang Theory, but demanding scientific proof of God when science can't even leave the universe to study the question of the cause of the universe is a pretty bad argument. But you will hear that a lot from atheists. And I would simply ignore it. Just ignore it. It's not a good argument. And another issue is always the burden of proof, right? The burden of proof simply means um, who has the responsibility to come forward with evidence in order to prove that something is true or worthy of belief. Now, the burden of proof is used in the law in civil cases and in criminal cases. And that burden is placed in civil cases, it's placed on the plaintiff, generally, the person who filed the lawsuit. And in criminal cases, it's placed on the prosecutor or the person who is prosecuting the criminal action. And that's rightfully so, because they're the ones who filed this complaint or this indictment. And it should be their responsibility to prove what they're claiming. That's their burden of proof. But in real life, there is no burden of proof. There's no rule book of life that says anybody has a particular burden to prove anything. So it's really the burden of proof argument is really a red herring. It just doesn't apply in real life to people, to ordinary issues, such as is there a God or not? There is no burden of proof written anywhere that applies on that question. And if somebody claims that there is, they ask them, well, show me what the book is. Show me a book that says that this is the rule. And they won't be able to because there is no standard book of rules when it comes to general questions in life. So there really isn't a burden of proof on anybody. Not at all. It's not your burden to prove a God exists. It's the question of whether God exists is a personal question of the level of persuasion somebody requires and whether they're persuaded to believe God exists, perhaps by using evidence. That's it. So, um, in conclusion, uh, be very careful when people make arguments about that the existence of God has been debunked, or that some philosophical argument, such as the cosmological arguments, have been debunked. That's not true. It's just not true. Understand what debunking really means. And it means that you've been persuaded that such and such is not true. It doesn't mean that simply somebody has objected. That happens all the time. It doesn't mean something has been disproven to be a fact. So, and beware of arguments concerning burdens of proof on everyday questions, including the existence of God. There is no burden of proof. There's no rule book that requires anyone to shoulder any sort of burden of proof. And be aware that you're allowed to use any sort of evidence that you feel is relevant, that has a tendency to prove or disprove any particular fact, such as whether God exists. And there's a whole list of different types of evidence. You're not stuck with one particular type of evidence, like scientific evidence. You're allowed to use all these types of evidence in combination. They can even cumulatively have the effect that you believe that something is true. Maybe the different types of evidence in and of themselves, each one isn't enough to prove it, but to you. But if you have enough of them, the cumulative effect of all of that evidence is enough to convince you that something is true, to persuade you uh, that something is more likely or not, such as that God exists. So be careful of a lot of these burden of proof and evidence type arguments when it comes to the question of the existence of God. They're oftentimes very faulty arguments, uh, and they're usually red herrings or made purposely to make the atheist argument look stronger than it really is. Okay, if you have any questions or comments, please leave it below. Press the subscribe button. I appreciate it. And I hope you learned something. Take care.